Okay, here we go. Playing 4 tables of Zoom. Hopefully this isn't going to be too crazy for y'all. I'm going to be demonstrating what I think is one of the optimal ways to play this format. Because the population is just playing a little bit too passively, too not aggressive enough in a bunch of spots, not getting in there with enough weak hands, enough kind of like fringy hands. Really, the best way to play. Um, Zoom is to just play like really, really solidly and kind of really attack players for playing too fit or fold and playing their hands kind of two face up against you. When you're particularly when you're playing at the low stakes, as a generality, you're going to think that most of your opponents are going to play too straightforward, and so I'm going to try to adopt strategies that punish, relatively straightforward players. On table 3, just going to 4 bet and then probably go with my hand, and on table 2 going to call facing a river bet here when I have an ace in my hand because it just unblocks so many of my opponent's bluffs at that point, and so I just think the likelihood of me playing my hand there is going to be very high. Here on trip sevens, definitely allowed to have a slightly larger bet sizing than 1/4, which is going to be very, very standard. And then so obviously now on the turn, happy to jam my hand, particularly also when a flush draw comes in. And if the guy just snaps me with aces, he snaps me with aces. But he'll also show me like tens here. I think aces and kings usually jam pre-flop, so he can have like some queens here is the most likely hand that calls and beats me. But I guess I just assume that after he's taken so long that I just have the best hand there. So yeah, us here on table 2 facing this small 3 bet. If I was suited, I could see a flop or consider 4 betting. But just gonna give this up and generally just gonna play slightly too tightly facing a re-raise in these games, mostly because one, my opponents are not re-raising enough, um, and two, because the rake is so prohibitive, it just means that I'm just gonna have to get out of the way most of the time, because the rake is not going to let me speculate or speculatively call like 3 bets or 4 bets with weaker hands. Also, in line with this idea that my opponents are going to play very straightforwardly, as a generality, one of the main reads that I'm going to rely on is the idea that bet size is representative of strength, particularly when my opponents exactly pot rivers. I think that this is a kind of a universal tell, mostly because like pot is the sizing that is the largest sizing that we can kind of bet in a fish's mind, simply because they don't really use like overbets, right? Maybe they have like all ins, but maybe if the pot is like 30 big blinds, there's 80 big blinds behind, they don't have the imagination to find jams there, just because in their own games they just don't have nearly enough bluffs there to make that balanced. Here, just gonna go ahead and raise small to make sure that I can get all of the money in on the river. Usually when my opponents bet small on the turn, it's forecasting that they're going to check back the river. Also in these games, because I think my opponents are straightforward, I don't think that it's very likely he's going to be triple barreling as bluff enough. So I just want to make sure that I'm going to uh, raise here and make sure all the money goes in myself. Ace 3 against a 3.5. This is actually close, and facing a 3.5, you can actually begin to fold ace 6, ace 7, ace 2, ace 3. But facing just the 3x, going to peel and get a pretty bad flop for us, because this should just be so dominating for under the gun. He checks back. I think his check backing range is going to have some jacks, some kings, aces. I mean, I just actually still lose to a lot of hands here. In theory, I should be checking this hand, but in practice, I think that now that we've reached the river, my opponent's going to be a little bit more jack X heavy than he actually should be. So just going to go ahead and bet. I think that's going to be a spot where, in theory, my opponent who checks back an ace should be checking back a lot of aces on the turn. And so to give that some due respect, I should probably be checking my weak aces on the river. Here I bet the flop, villain calls, and we get to the river. I think he does bet some of his fives on an earlier street, so I think the likelihood is that he's got like ace high, king high, pocket sixes or something like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in a blocker and then fold to a raise. Easy game. Here, my opponent limps and then bets large here. Just going to give up under pairs to the board. think that's that's a pretty good plan as a default, right? Here I have aces. Gonna go ahead and put in the 4-bet, and my opponent instantaneously calls. Flop is a little bit mixed. Villain should have tens. I should not have tens here, but the other two cards are relatively low. I don't think either of us can have eights or twos. So when villain only has one of the possible sets here, just betting small is totally fine. This might be a spot where, because villain called so quickly pre-flop, it's just most likely that he has kind of like some suited Broadway hand, and it's not. I think it's just unlikely he's got a hand like maybe jacks or queens, because those hands just at least think a little bit more before they decide what they do. So I think I might have made a small mistake there and should have checked there with a hand as strong as aces, and because my hand's virtually invulnerable. After I check back a hand like queen seven of spades, the seven of spades is really good on blocking all of my opponent's hearts, fours, sixes, etc. So just gonna check back and go call, and pretty amazed that my opponent didn't put in a larger bet on the river there. Really happy when my opponents pick these nice, comfortable sizings that really just don't put me into any difficult positions. Fours under the gun is going to be a fold. I think fives under the gun actually should be a fold in these high-rake games as well. There's a lot of argument for raising more hands because we have an edge over opponent, but a lot of the times when we have an edge, it's like turning a hand that is a neutral hand to maybe like a 0.2 hand, right? It's not like when we raise a hand, suddenly we're just going to be winning like half a big blind more because the opponent is bad, right? And so I think a lot of the times we really overestimate how much we're paying in rake versus how much our skill edge is. So for example, in X or Y spot, if on average we're paying 0.6 big blinds in rake to play all of these kind of extra hands, these might be spots where in the long run we are just paying too much rake, and that we're not actually making it up with our edge. So yeah, we'll have like a skill edge, or we'll have the extra 0.2 big blind advantage over like some guys, but definitely not others. I was gonna bet small here, intending to thinking about betting large on the river. I'm actually gonna still continue to. Actually, no, I don't think that this is gonna be a spot where I can even get my opponent off many ace high, so I'm just gonna give it up here. And then here on table 4, have a pretty natural barrel off here. I think as long as no spade comes. The 10 to the 9 are going to be offsuit, so they're going to unblock a lot of my opponent's call fold range. I think that in that formation, I mostly want to have some kind of like middling cards when I barrel off, because I think I'm trying to get my opponent to fold like ace 9, ace 8, stuff like that by the river. Check back aces here, obviously gonna super snap call. Easy game. And I think that this is actually one of the biggest arguments of why we actually don't want to range bet on the flop. And I know that's, obviously very in vogue. That's something that I have, frequently taught over the years. And it's not so much that that's not a good strategy. Actually, it's a very, very good strategy, particularly if you're playing against opponents who are stronger than you, because, you're going to get into a situation where you're never going to be sacrificing much EV in return, getting to play a strategy that hopefully negates a lot of your opponent's at least flop edges. Here with sixes, obviously have to call. Nines, no reason to ever raise here. Sets really have to call here just to protect my range. Because on these low boards, like on these low boards, basically, I have to, when I do have like, have low cards, like maybe even like pocket sevens here, just go call, call, call. And so, if that is the case, well, then obviously when I have my sets here, they should just go call, call, call as well. Villain doesn't jam the river. Obviously, I'm going to jam the river for myself. And there we go. Running good. I mean, I assume that villain had like aces or kings there. Kings. It's kind of curious that he bet such a small amount on the flop and didn't pick a sizing that just tried to put all the money in. I think in the long run, this is definitely one of the advantages I have over my opponents, is that if you ever watch me play in single raise pots, even pretty deep, I end up going all in a fair amount of the time. just because, with both bluffs and value bets, I'm able to pick a max pressure. And as a eagle eye generality, you want to be betting very, very large, both for bluff and for value, because the larger you bet for value, mathematically, the more bluffs you are allowed to have as a percentage of range. So the larger I bet, the more hands I am able to make profitable, or at least indifferent in that spot, rather than automatically lose it by checking back. Right. So the larger you bet, the more bluffs you get to have, the more parts of your range get to be profitable or neutral. Um, and in turn, those probably make other parts of your range more profitable. Here's with sixes with the spade, probably have to peel one more time. Not too thrilled about it. And then now that he's given up, I'm gonna give up here, and somehow won. Happy with this result. I raise Jack six, and my opponent min three bets me. And usually facing a min three bet, my plan is to get there. Right, I'm just gonna call and play very, very cautiously on a lot of flops. I think that there's just way too many instances where, one, it's possible that your opponent min three bet as a misclick, and so and this so this obviously does not does not occur live, but they might have reached for the 9x or 12x, and they just accidentally just plus raise instead. And I found over many, many millions of hands that when people are three betting these kind of like medium sizings, it is not hugely indicative of weakness, right? You'll still actually see a lot of aces, kings, etc. in these kind of ranges. In the big blind, I think that one of the correct strategies that you could play here is to basically three bet like 35% of your hands, of all of your offsuit aces, all of your offsuit kings that continue, and just really punish your opponents for the fact they don't four bet enough. And so what this does is basically you just over realize, and then you play very, very cautiously on flops because your opponents are generally going to have much stronger ranges than you, mostly because you just have like a ridiculous amount of air. You have like 35% of your range when you reach the turn. Reach the flop, but your opponent obviously is going to only have like 10 to 12% of his range. Also, this that strategy is extremely, extremely bad if you do occasionally run into the more tag players who are four betting you a lot. But it's kind of a population play. But as a whole, and I think this is probably true of a lot of my viewers, you're not four betting nearly enough small blind versus big blind. And to be frank, that might be correct because the general pool is not three betting enough and not three betting polar enough. So you don't really need to really come after them super aggressively. And so because that is how you've been conditioned, I should be three betting the heck out of you. Weaker player in the big blind here. So a hand that is very, very neutral or very, very slightly losing, I do think is now slightly winning. On table 4, the small blind is a little bit stronger than the big blind when he calls here. So he's going to have a little bit more like middling interaction here. This doesn't look particularly strong, but I'm not really going to come after it without any equity or blockers. Maybe if I had a queen there, a gut shot, something I could occasionally go for it, but want to have a little bit of something and try to, as a generality, make some just giant assumptions about how my opponents are playing and suddenly end up playing, a middling or very large pot with very little equity. I think one of the advantages that I've had philosophically over the years when I'm playing against recreationals is that like I don't make that many assumptions about what they're doing without pretty good reads, right? So like just the random population, obviously I'm going to say, oh, they're a little bit too passive, they're a little bit too loose, they're not really solid enough, they have some kind of like basic bet sizing tells. But beyond that, the individual nuances and leaks of my opponents are honestly beyond me, and so I just kind of play a generally very, very solid strategy and kind of expand once I have more information, and that has served me extremely well over the years. There's definitely some guys, and this might be really, really successful for them. They play a strategy where they go for like really, really extreme things, and I have to admit, I definitely go for some kind of more extreme plays. Sometimes I'll see like a specific timing tell or read and play my hand, and it's actually hard to tell. Am I winning more because of that, or am I just running pretty good? For example, let's say I get to a spot and this guy wiggles his mustache a little bit, and I think, oh, okay, wow, he's got a tell of weakness, and so I jam 2x the pot, and he folds, 66 to 70% of the time, right? And slightly overfolds there. Well, it might just be the case where villain slightly overfolds as a generality, right? So there's going to be a lot of times where they fold whatever 70% of the time, and suddenly we're just like, oh, this, our read was really good. We keep winning these pots, but in reality, we're not winning more than if we had acted without a read, right? Here I start with a small bet on the flop. Turn is quite good for me. Here on table 3, went check check on the flop. I think I'm just gonna now try to check my hand down. I'm gonna give up this bluff with sixes, particularly when the back door comes in. And now just gonna give up ace jack against that sizing. It is tempting to to think about jamming there. I think I want to jam there when I have the king of spades more often. I think that ace jack is just so far in in my folding range that if I start turning hands like that and hands that may be slightly better into either calls or raises, I'm just going to be overcalling way too often in that spot, right? It's kind of a subtle art, but when you're turning your hand into a bluff, you have to really make sure that you're not just turning hands that you would fold all the time into bluffs, right? These hands have to actually be very, very close to the bottom of your calling range, top of your folding range. Otherwise, if you're just constantly turning, just like random hands into bluffs, you are wildly over bluffing and wildly under folding in a bunch of spots. So you'll just find yourself paying off too often. And it's hard to actually realize that you're doing that and make sure that you're calibrated in such a way. Here, the small blind picks a very large sizing. I think we can just give this up. It's actually quite close. Against the big blind there, I think I would always defend, but against the small blind, he's just a little bit tighter here. Gonna be looser than what GTO recommends on table 4. I think as again, speaking in generalities, opening an early position more tightly than what GTO recommends, and then opening more loosely than what GTO recommends in late position is the way to do it, right? I think when you raise under the gun, you get too much smoke from the players in front of you. They're going to be 3-betting you, but not even 3-betting you. They're just going to be calling a lot and triggering the rake. And so because of that, what happens is a lot of the time, hands like I don't know, like ace 2 suited, king jack offsuit, and the ilk are no longer profitable. 6-9's going to start with a call. Hands too good and too bad to raise. Here on this river, it's close. The 6 can both go for a block and decide to check call on a turn that is just very likely for my opponent to take a stab at. I'm a little surprised Villain didn't bet the turn there with a 9, but obviously he's played his hand well. Here, raise pocket 10s get called in position. Board comes very low. Gonna start with a range check on a board where Villain can have all of the sets and I can, really only have pocket 6s here. Facing this size, this hand does raise a very, very small frequency of the time. Gonna call this time. The ace is pretty good. Don't think that he should be betting too many ace-x on the flop, but obviously when these players are not good, they can kind of show up with a little bit of everything. And now here, I definitely think that my hand is enough value to go for a river block. Gonna keep calling with ace-5. Probably gonna call on a bunch of blank rivers. Yeah, this is still a limp pot. So yeah, just gonna press call, and obviously I can just like run into random hands. Oh, limp jacks. And here 10's facing a block from what I assume to be a weaker opponent. I just don't think that there's any reason for I'm sorry, facing a raise from a weaker opponent. Just no reason to think he's turning his hand into a bluff there. And definitely think I get called, called by worse when he just calls. A couple limpers. Board comes really, really good for me. So I'm going to start with a small bet and then follow up with pressure on the next street. I just think that villain's just not going to have too many super strong Broadway hands, etc., etc. Turn is not very good for me. Gonna check here. Don't like continuing to bet very often when the board pairs because very often I'm gonna bet and get raised. When you're running bluffs, you very rarely want the board to improve in coordination because it's very likely your opponent's going to be hitting those kind of pairs. When villain pots it here, I can actually just give up my hand. Calling there out of position now seems very, very gross. I think raising there is pretty gross, and I think that my opponent's just probably turning his hand very face up. I think it's very easy to find the pot button when you have a 10x there, and I think it's not that easy to find it when you have a variety of bluffs. 8's facing a 3x from early position is just going to be a fold. Here I call with ace-8 facing a small bet. Villain continues to bet small, and I'm very happy to keep the pot relatively small here. And after villain checks the river, I don't really think that there is too much value here. Villain is on the worse end, so I can go for something maybe very, very small here. But against regular players there, you probably just want to check because the threat of getting a raise on the river is just too enormous. I think ace-jack is very, very close here. I think it's not like an automatic raise from this position. And here now the board has come double Broadway. Obviously, it's going to be quite good for us, and it looks pretty juicy to fire off. Hit that half pawn on table 1. Board is has a little bit more texture to it, so don't mind kind of preventing equity switches now. Here on the turn, gonna bet near 3/4 to set up the river very comfortably. And obviously gonna call a raise. Nice. Want a pretty big pot. And this is, when people are like, oh, why does my red line suck? A lot of the times it's because, the key to having a really good red line is to getting your opponent to put in as much money as possible and then fold. All right. So you want your opponent to call thinking that, maybe I can realize my equity, maybe I can see some showdowns, but then suddenly you shut the door with these, large overbets. And not only do the overbets force your opponent just to fold, a large percentage of the time, off the bat, but also when you have very, very good hands, or you're running a bluff, what this does is it gets your opponent to call like 2 large bets, and then or like a small bet and a large bet, and then fold the river. And so, if my opponents are going 1/3, 1/3, 2/3, it's not going to be making nearly as much money as me when I'm going like 1/3 and then I double overbet the turn. And because you're going to see enough double overbets out of me, it's going to be a spot where you just can't make the assumption that I'm always nutted there because just from a frequency thing, if you play against me, you just see I just have a bunch of overbets in my game, and so you must assume that some of those are going to be bluffs. Raise ace jack pre. Obviously going to start on this flop. And now I think ace jack is way too much showdown value to try to turn it into a bluff. Here, villain polarizes in a spot where I should just have so many aces and possibly some 6s as well. So I think I can just easily give this up. My opponent limps. I'm gonna start by getting some value with tens. Turn, unfortunately, it makes it difficult to get value from worse, so I'm going to check back and evaluate the river. And when villain snap checks to me on the river, I think the likelihood of him having a better hand is now somewhat reduced, so I'm going to go for value against like a 7 or an 8 type hand. Oh, villain selling an ace. Good for him. 4-bet ace queen here. Flop comes obviously extraordinarily good for me. Going to start with a small bet. And then here with ace 9, probably going to keep betting. Here this jack's actually really, really bad for me because one of the cards that is most likely to improve here is the pocket jacks. So I'm going to check here. And then obviously putting the money in at this SPR. Never calling here. And if he shows me, a better hand, good for him. Ugh, queen jack. What a cooler. What a cooler. Gonna 3-bet this hand, which usually is just gonna be a flat, but again, because I'm arguing that my opponents are not 3-betting enough, I just get to realize too much equity. And just get to see too many flops in position with the betting lead, right? Like, this is the bread and butter of poker. Raising, getting heads up, and just forcing my opponent to have some kind of equity on the flop. If he doesn't have any interaction, he just has to get out of the way, and I just, think that the more often that I am putting my opponents into these very frustrating spots, the better I'm doing. I'm gonna start with a pot size bet here on blocking the spades. Ace 8 is close. I think again, because my opponents are a little bit on the tight end, I can make a slightly tight fold there. But if you get in there, obviously, not going to discredit you there. And here facing a limp, going to isolate. You get to isolate extraordinarily wide here. I'm always surprised that, a hand like 2s over a very, very large sample size is profitable here. I think a lot of the times what happens is, you make it 5x, and even though you're making that raise with a wide range, as bluff, it's definitely very effective because it's going to get some of the big blinds to fold out some hands that are, arguably better than yours or perform well. And then the in-position player facing the 5x is just, he's going to have to just give a lot of credence to the fact that you can have a bunch of strong hands there. Check the flop. A lot of my opponents' check back range should have some, 10s or aces here. Don't really think that I can just go bet here, but I can check and hopefully get in a couple streets. Let's see what my opponent had there. Hopefully he had total air, right? Like, if he had an ace, then I've lost value against him. Fortunately, he had a quite strong ace, so I'm a little shocked. Let's see. Here, obviously, ace queen is going to be a flop call. If villain checks, I'm pretty sure that this hand is close here between, betting now and then kind of going into a line later on. Or checking here and then kind of looking for bluffs on a future street. I think, villain should be pretty capped here. Should not have too many flushes. Obviously, sometimes I'm going to get jammed on and feel like a complete idiot. But because my opponent is capped, really just going to try to target his, 2-pair type hands there. I isolate Jack 10 and get squozen. Definitely think that this guy can be coming at me a little bit lightly. So, want to at least start with a defense. Fortunately here, flop absolutely nothing, so just have to give it up. Red line down. Very unhappy. And again, right, just going back to, the bread and butter example, I didn't have the betting lead. And so I had the onus of hitting a hand. It's hard to hit equity in poker. I've been playing a lot more pot limit Omaha, and I am just always amazed at how, despite having 4 cards, I just never seem to have anything. Like I play a lot of bomb pots too. How do I never have anything? Villain bet's very small on the flop here. I do think this hand gets in a tiny amount. And, should be pretty hard for opponent to have a lot of strong hands after he super snap checks the turn. So let's kind of go for it. Definitely a spot where when the turn comes in, brings in some gut shots, etc. I can have it. Also, I'll have some traps that called from the flop. Here 4-6 just a fold. I don't know why I was taking forever with this. Here villain checks back the flop in the presence of a weaker player, so I just think it's very unlikely he's got a very strong hand here. I do block some 7x's here, but I do think that there is going to be a value bet to be had. Nines against the 3x is just going to be a fold. Ace 2 is going to be a raise. Although I'm always a little bit extra cautious when the under the gun player raises here. Because they're just a little bit stronger than usual. Sometimes they have like limp re-raises and stuff. Check back the flop. Gonna just keep checking here, and hopefully my opponent will find the ability to find a bluff. Now that we've gotten to the river in this fashion, gonna now put in an overbet. Think my hand is the best. Think sometimes he's got a bluff catcher because he didn't bluff by the river. And I think some people will say, "Oh my God, that never gets called." Oh my God, does that get called all the time? It is wild how loosely people call that. There's been a lot of times where I've seen people argue, "Oh man, you should bet smaller um, for value and bet larger as bluff." And I'm like, "Are you really sure? Have you not spent enough time, going for these really really oppressive and large value bets and see that they still get called because your opponent is in whatever kind of like leveling game?" Right? I've definitely bet like 6 times the pot and gotten called by worse. So, when you're asking, should I be balanced with the sizings? In my opinion, the answer is yes. It is possible that you are somehow ultra maximizing against like the weakest players um, by picking a smaller sizing for value and a larger sizing as bluff. But I just don't think that's very useful. And I do find a lot of instances where finding large sizing as bluff is very, very good. So it's not like I want to, somehow remove that balance. Obviously, gonna 4-bet with Ace King. 3-7 against this min raise. I think the suited million gappers get in there. I think it is good enough. I'm a little disgusted by it, but let's say it gets in there. King Jack again, uh, a mixed raise, but I think that because of the rake and the likelihood that my opponents are going to be cold calling in position, this hand now is slightly losing. Same with Ace 4, right? Hurts my soul to fold Ace 4. I think at the higher stakes, this is absolutely profitable and slightly better than neutral, right? Once you get to 200, 500, definitely be opening all of your suited aces. But in these games in particular, just 25 and 50 zone, I don't think that my students over extraordinarily large samples were able to make those hands profitable. I mean, bread and butter. Isolate in position, bet small, evaluate. Really what's going on is that, I say this all the time. The function of the small continuation bet really serves as like a jab when we think it from, kind of like a boxing perspective. I want to use it to set up plays in the future, right? I want to just jab a lot and then kind of see what response does my opponent what response does this elicit from my opponent. Are they going to be, overly defensive and just like fold a lot? Are they going to suddenly become overly passive and just call a lot? Are they going to be very, very spewy and just check raise me a ton? And once I have this kind of understanding of what their baseline play is, suddenly I get to really, really crush them. So obviously, if they just call too much or they fold too much, then range betting becomes, really, really good. I mean, not because, when my opponent calls too much, I'm suddenly, over bluffing against them, but it's more so that I'm getting to a turn with a lot of really, really wide ranges. And even if my opponent, is going to have, a slight equity advantage against me with like the bottom of his range type hands, he's just going to, ace 10 here is basically never, never a 3-bet here, but again, we're trying to play very, very exploitatively. I completely forgot what I was going to say because now I'm suddenly thinking about table 1. Here on table 2, want to play definitely a kind of a mixed strategy. I think here the way we are going to determine my mix is based on what my suits are. Villain just leads out into me. I'm just gonna give it to him. I think ace 10 is just a little bit too low in my range, and this is definitely one of the reasons why we play ace king like this is because, what hand am I really representing when I jam here? Sometimes an 8, but an 8 doesn't bet the turn, right? I don't have too many 8s in my range as a whole. Can't have quad 4s. So, I don't really represent that many hands. And so when I jam there, villain's going to be like, oh, he only represents ace king, didn't 4-bet pre-flop. Guess what? I have ace king. Let's kind of look up what my opponent had. I suspect queens. Queens is, I think the pocket pair that makes the most sense. Oh, he had king queen. He had king queen. Queens makes sense there because if my opponent doesn't put me on ace king, the most likely hand that I'm value betting there is king queen suited. And so if you have pocket queens there, it just reduces the combinations I can have there so dramatically. I think 6-7 is extraordinarily neutral, but with the presence of the small blind, this probably tips over to being very, very slightly profitable. And now we see that the big blind has called me in position, so he's likely to be a weaker player. And so against these guys, a really, really good baseline strategy is to just kind of bet small when we have a little bit of equity. And I've also found that after we bet very small here, my opponents are going to be over bluffing a lot, so I can just bet small, check call pretty blindly. Here, villain min raises flop bet's turn. I still think I'm a little bit too high in my range to find a fold. Now that diamonds have rolled off, obviously I can find a fold. Villain min raises here. Unfortunately, gonna have to peel with king queen, but at least we're in position here. In position to both players, and I assume that both of them are a little bit weaker. This is not absolutely horrible, but facing a 3-bet of any reasonable size with king queen offsuit from early position, we are just getting out of dodge. And then now villain bets on a board that's low, not really good, in the presence of a weaker player. We just expect him to, to have a relatively good range here. Villain leads out into us large. I think on triple Broadway boards, my opponents don't have enough bluffs there. Like on a triple Broadway board, what are your natural bluffs? Assuming you're not just turning all your like random pairs into a bluff. And then some of your bluffs that are pairs are like, pair plus open-ender, etc., right? So a lot of those hands just have way too much equity, don't really want to F around. And certainly don't want to find out. 3-bet ace queen here. The question is, what is the best way to get the money in here? I think it's actually checking and letting my opponent jam on me. Because he might jam something that's like a worse ace high, something like that, right? So. And now I think this might be for value. Well, obviously not for value there. Unfortunate. My opponent bets large on this flop. Gosh, when he bets 3/4 on a mono flop, I'm actually just I'm just ready to dump my hand there, and that's probably not extraordinarily kosher from a theoretical perspective. But I think that, I mean, one, it's not very kosher for him to to bet that sizing in the first place. But once my opponent has come really out of line, I get to get really out of line as well. Definitely get to overbet on this flop where it's very, very hard for my opponent to have top set, middle set, a lot of two pair combinations there. So overbetting is going to be good here. Usually going to overbet, or I'm sorry, three bet on table 3 when I have an offsuit 8. Uh, Table 1 both plays as a down bet flop, or can also play as a check back and fold, depending on what strategy you want to play. I think this is reasonable. Again, here on Queen 9/6, could play a check back and mix strategy where this hand would probably fall closer to a check back. When you have these kind of like middling aces that block some of your opponent's double back doors, you kind of block too much of your opponent's like middling calling range, and so those hands are naturally going to be checks here. No quarter here. This was going to be a board where I could start with overbets if I wanted to, and so when villain leads here, obviously going to begin pounding. Here turn brings in nothing unless villain somehow has like 3/4, and so just going to go ahead and bet quite a quite hefty amount here. Three bet pre-flop, and board comes good for us, right? All of these like two Broadway boards are always going to be really, really good for us. The question is how I want to play my hand from here. After villain super checks or super snap calls the flop, I think that my hand actually might be best a lot here. So gonna call the turn and evaluate the river. Good for us. I assume we had the best hand on the turn. Maybe he was betting something very, very small on the turn for protection, like... Wow, villain had ace-king there and did not bet the river. That is mind-numbing to me. Did have the best hand on the turn, though. And this is why we, we over-aggress in a lot of parts of the pre-flop game tree. It's because, your opponents are just way, way, way too passive. And so we just get there too often. Here, villain leads on an ace-high flop after limping early position. Story checks out that he's got a hand. I like pointing out that, in a lot of these spots, there are multiple sizings and strategies that we can play that are going to be near equilibria. And so, it's very easy to get super judgmental about someone's play. It's like, oh, they're good, they're bad, they don't know what they're doing, yada, yada, yada. But even among extremely, extremely studied players, there is a lot of variation on how they approach individual spots that are just like not uniform. So any spot that has, different stack sizes, different pre-flop sizes, involves like multiple callers, involves the presence of a fish, et cetera, et cetera. These are going to all be spots where, people are going to get kind of out of line. Like, let's say you raise a giant whale calls you, and then a giant whale calls you, and then someone squeezes. Like, what is your range there to call? Um, when villain raises flop, I think the likelihood is that he's got like sometimes pocket fours, sometimes ace four, a hand like this here. No real reason to raise when he's just giving me such a juicy price here. And obviously, should he, he checked to me on the river, I'm gonna bluff. Unfortunate that we get a lead here because I wanted to just see this check through. So I think that the best way to play this now is to call and then donk if I get there on the river. So I'm going to take this line. Fortunately whiff, and now we lose our souls. I just don't think we have any fold equity. I just didn't, there's no real reason to like raise on the turn, right? We're getting the correct price. Here villain is what I assumed to be a recreational, so gonna size up slightly to make sure that we get all the money in. And obviously, if he's got pocket nines, I am cooked. I am the cooked. I don't know why in my hotkeys I have two 2.5s. Just really want to make sure I don't min raise. Here there's a variety of strategies here. I think both checking, I think betting and putting it in. All of these things are going to be pretty good here. Ace-9 very likely to be the best hand against a weaker player here. Normally getting into like overbet territory or overbet or check territory is very reasonable here, but I just think that Ace-9 is so strong that I can just go for 3 streets here. And as long as I don't get raised, I think I have the best hand. Here Queen Jack gonna play overbet or check, but because I have the nothing, this hand probably does not fit into an overbet. Although, you would look at it and be like, oh, this is a very, very obvious overbet, but I don't really block any of my opponents like medium medium aces here, because he would 3-bet, ace queen, etc., etc. Here with kings, gonna start with a call. Villain continues to bet, but picks a relatively small sizing here. Gonna keep calling here. I mean, villain can just have anything. Oh, I think I accidentally cold 4. I accidentally cold 4 here, so that's not great. Villain can also just have anything. It's more likely that he's going to have a 6 than me, but I think especially after I just go check, check, check. Gonna have to pick off a non-ridiculous sizing, right? It's only when your opponent starts going like pot or something that you're like, okay, maybe I need to think about getting out of the way. Do get a little bit of value / protection / realization against the in-position player, right? Like I can bet small and make sure that the small blind never just like goes absolutely ham on me. This guy's the original raiser, cold called the 4-bet check to the flop. Yeah, I don't know, man. I think I'm just gonna have to just peel here myself. And obviously I'm just gonna jam here and hopefully he's got ace king. If he folds here, then my call on the turn was definitely really good. Yeah, okay, so my call was definitely correct. I don't think that this hand gets to fold, but I'm actually, I'm not thrilled about what my prospects are, but I do think I do see some occasionally random hands. Here, going to start with a slightly larger bet on the board that is somewhat favorable for me. 3-bet ace king. Very standard, everyone folds. 9's facing a 3x here. I can just put the money in for sure if he 4-bets me. Easy game. I mean, very, very standard, 50 big blinds here. Face cold 4. I think this is pretty bad here. I think I can find a fold. It's close. It's close. I really don't like holding a jack because, that's blocking a lot of my opponent's bluffing range. King jack, those kind of hands. A quarter. It's very useful here. Don't want to bloat the pot. Definitely want to get some value / protection. My opponent should not find very many folds on the flop. Question is, what do I want to do on the turn? It's like, how much do I think that he's got an overpair when he just calls on the turn versus like a hand like ace king, ace queen here? I'm gonna pick a sizing that hurts. You know, because this is a spot where, because he's just checked to me multiple times, I can have anything, right? There we go. Now I hit a king on this river. Probably need to just check back here. I can't really imagine after I've bet the turn that I'm going to be able to get value from worse, and sometimes I'll get jammed on, so. Yay, sucked out. Here we raise 9-10. Get a good flop for us. Just going to start with a small bet. Bread and butter. And the way the small bet works is that, you know, if your opponent folds way too much, obviously you're just printing really, really hard. And not only are you printing really hard, but it also means that on a lot of runouts, your opponents are not going to have the board coverage that they need to be able to call you down on future streets, right? So when your opponents are not calling you with enough like double backdoors, when boards come like, you know, running low cards, running medium cards, running backdoor flushes, they're just not going to have enough of that because they overfolded on the flop. So you just kind of get to run roughshod on them, regardless if you knew this or not, right? Like, you might not know that they don't have enough flushes on the river to be able to call you, but you're still going to just be, you know, naturally bluffing that spot a lot and just not realizing, oh wow, when I bluff this spot now, I'm just getting like a, you know, a ton of extra efficiency. Ace queen, pretty close at this depth. I do think that calling here is not horrible. The question is how I want to play this. It's, you know, obviously if I have something like ace 2, ace 3, ace 6, ace 4, these kind of hands are, you know, more likely to go ahead and put in a raise. But a hand like this might just want to go ahead and call. Call with pocket tens. Pretty standard. Villain down bets. You know, very standard for me to call here. And I think here ace with ace queen, because I block the queen here. Want to check, go for a check raise a lot. And obviously have to give up a tens on that king turn, particularly because tens are just blocking so many of my opponent's natural bluffs at that point. And, you know, as I said at these stakes, I'm not giving my opponent credit for having unnatural bluffs, right? My opponents are not barreling off with another, like, with enough overcard, undercard type combinations for me to really be stressing out. Right? They just don't have enough hands that make me truly, truly indifferent because they're playing a little bit too passively pre-flop. Right? So when you're playing against like Old Man Coffee, you don't really have difficult decisions in terms of whether or not your opponent has enough bluffs or not. The answer is they just never have enough bluffs simply because they're playing so tight that they just can't have, you know, these hands that are going to make you neutral on rivers. They just always have the nuts as, you know, as part of their entire range. The only way that you'll be able to, you know, start to become indifferent is if Old Man Coffee starts like 100% of the time turning a hand like pocket twos into a bluff when it has like bottom pair or an underpair to the board, right? When if he's always like blasting off like twos, threes, fours, you know, fourth pair, fifth pair, then okay, now suddenly we start have to kind of like look him up. But if your opponents aren't doing this and they're just playing kind of like solid and standardly with a lot of the middling parts of their range and just not building huge pots, then obviously you're not really being put into any kind of spot. Sixes facing a 3x is going to be a call. Pretty good flop for us. Not one that is automatically going to trigger a lot of barrels from my opponent here. Picking a half pot sizing, obviously going to have to call with a 6. Turn is very good for us. Turn's so good for us that we can actually consider having a leading range. Now here on the river, a 6 is probably going to want to put in a small blocker bet, and mostly trying to get value from an ace or a king. When villain bets here, or raises me here, I think that when I have a 6, this hand is supposed to be very, very indifferent here. I think actually I'm just going to press call this time. I think turning that hand into a bluff and then reblasting on him is probably better. Or actually, no, actually, that. Now that I think about it, because the river was trip 5s, that hand actually probably was one of the better hands for me to turn into a bluff. So probably missed an opportunity to find a jam there, but, totally fine. Here ace queen suited would always get in there. I think if this guy was on the button and this guy 3-bet ace queen also gets in there, but I think I have to be a little bit tighter than that. I mean, basically, I just have so few value hands there, because I probably am, folding jacks some percentage of the time, that I just don't need many bluffs to balance me out. If villains are not 3-betting enough, there's certainly not that much reason for me to want to suddenly pounce on them with like cold 4-bets, etc. Oh, I think I accidentally folded ace jack there. Whoops. Again, extremely, extremely neutral, so not really gonna sweat it. I bet that you make, I don't know, 0.1, 0.05 big blinds playing that hand. And so if you're only making 0.05 big blinds playing that hand, but it takes you like 3 minutes to play that hand, sometimes it's better just to have folded that and then have, cycled through, I don't know, 20, 30 hands, and then, you're 10% closer to getting a hand like aces. So it's not only just, the nature of zone and human psychology makes this a game where everyone's just going to be a little bit tighter, but it's also just, the cost benefit of getting out of line and playing all of these neutral hands becomes like lower and lower, both because of the rake and the time investment. Here, King Queen is going to be a mixed 3-bet, going to flat this time. Get a really good flop for us. Obviously, going to be able to happily call multiple streets when opponent checks. Going to play a polar strat. And obviously, because I'm so high in my range, I'm going to start with something like a bet. Still really strong here on the turn. And now I believe this hand probably just checks the river. I can still run into like ace king here. Sometimes he has some like weird sneaky traps. And then villain leads here on the turn without much money behind, so I'm just gonna have to unfortunately give him credit. Here with ace jack, gonna check. This hand really has no purpose in trying to put money in the pot. I think I'm actually gonna now value bet ace jack here against another ace high. There we go. My opponent called with ace 10. Yay. Always such a good feeling when you correctly value bet your ace. Particularly in 3-bet pots, feels too good. Here on 8-6-2, mostly gonna play a larger bet or a check strategy. This hand would probably often fall into a check. I want to be betting here when I have either the ace of clubs or I have ace of hearts, king of spades. So it's the clubs that match the board the least. And what this does is then it gets my opponent to be able to call with another ace high that is worse than mine because he has the dominated ace with the backdoor clubs. Obviously going to find a raise on the river, and I think I'm just going to fold to a jam here. Generally not really thrilled to put in a lot of money with the second high flush and then fold, but I think that this is going to be a spot where I'm going to overbet here. My opponent's just not going to be able to find like natural bluffs there, so I'm just going to keep firing through. Here turn improves me dramatically, so I'm going to keep firing. And after overbetting flop, I mean, this is going to put a ton of pressure on my opponent's like top pair, good kicker type holdings. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed a value bet, or I missed a bet on the flop here. Now that I've checked, I'm the one who's most likely to have aces or kings in my opinion, so occasionally I can now just go bet. My opponent raises me here, which is just like kind of BS. Also, like, I mean, I can't really continue here, but if he had any kind of hand, I don't understand why he would want to raise it here, because he's just keeping a lot of my bluffs here. Like if he has like jacks or something like that. So don't really know what's going on, but just gonna fold. But was gonna turn my hand into a bluff. So if he did have a value hand, he did lose some monies. But definitely missed a flop bet. Should have just probably just bet flop bet turn there. And I think that's going to be pretty good. King 4 as a defense. Here on table 3, this is definitely way out of line here, but I'm gonna just try to call out my opponent for not checking back enough diamonds or enough queens here. And so I think that I get to do this. And this hand is not horrible to bet over bet. Mostly because, with this hand I unblock all of my opponent's like call folds, right? So my opponent should have like, it looks like he's got a 10 here maybe. Like a jack 10 that calls turn folds river, but I think as a whole, that's pretty good. When there's 21 big blinds in the middle, ace king just plays his jam. Here I have to float with king jack, and after my opponent checks to me, unlikely he's got a 10. Unlikely he's got an ace, because an ace should not bet the turn that often. Here against a weaker player, I think going bet, check, call is very, very reasonable with this hand. 6 is not very good, so definitely have to be careful. You're going to check again. Hard to get value from worse. Villain doesn't even think about betting, so, you know. Obviously checking was going to be the better play if our opponent showed his hand face up and told us that he was going to be too passive. I'm going to start with a call with pocket eights. Nothing else I can really do here. Turn is quite bad and probably one where I have to now give up, particularly because the 8, you know, has both interaction with the 6 and the jack. So it's a little bit of like at the crossroads for all of his gut shots. So it means it just like blocks way too many things, right? Like, you know, 9, 10, 8, 7, etc. So have to just give this up. Here, villain starts with a bet. I'm going to check call the flop and hope that the turn increases the interactivity of the board so that now I can check raise turn and it's going to look like I turned some kind of draw. I was going to call with king queen. And now I have the ace of diamonds, so this gives me, you know, a little bit of coverage here. So, no real reason to value bet on table 4, and I check in villain just like snap picks a polar sizing here. Just don't think that there's that many hands that I beat here. I think villain's just gonna like snap check back a lot of it's like pocket 2s, pocket 3s, etc. So. Jack 9-4 definitely a board where I can start with, I mean, a variety of bet sizings here. I think overbet is perfectly reasonable here. With the diamonds as well. So I overbet flop, villain calls. Here I think in theory diamonds is now mostly a turn check because, you know, I block so many of my opponents like floats and then full turn. I think this is actually reasonable here. The 7, you know, has brought in the lower gut shot as well. So I think checking here and then hitting some kind of strange hand is somewhat powerful. This is also kind of giving respect to the fact that when I overbet flop, my opponent's going to just have it a lot. Because I think, you know, I should be getting huge overfold, and if I hold this hand, he's just more likely to have a jack or a 9. If I had queen 10 of other suits there, probably would have fired off, unblocking my opponent's diamonds. Three bet jacks. I mean, not super happy to face a giant re-raise here. Like, if he just makes it like 30 at this depth, maybe I just have to get rid of my hand. Ace-5 is probably the very, very bottom of my range here, and, you know, honestly, this hand might be, again, very, very close, because I just expect too many people to cold call in position to make this profitable. I think here this hand is going to barrel off. I don't think that after I get called on the flop, the 5 has too much showdown value. And I think that with my ace, I do block ace king offsuit, which my opponent should have in some, you know, very, very small amount here. Now that the club comes out, I'm actually not going to bluff unless I had a club in my hand here, so now I'm just going to give up. But we do see that my opponent called me with like a 10 on the flop, so you know, when the board came, if the board blanked out there, that definitely would have been a spot where I could have just gone for it. But thankfully, I saw the signs, and the signs were clubs. I found that I always say club like they do in Key and Peele with the substitute teacher. And I've been saying that for like 20 years now. I'd say clubs. 9-jack. Like my suited 9x here might kind of get in here, but I think this hand is probably just a little bit too weak. Obviously, queens are going to bump it up. Um, Tens definitely wants a little bit of protection here. Get about half pot. This hand, you know, on all of these kind of like low boards, you do want to have some kind of checking range with like some of your overpairs, mostly giving credit to the fact that your opponent can have, you know, pocket fives, 5-4, and fours, and you can't really have any of them. Facing raise, obviously, with overpair. Gonna start with a call. And unless my opponent does something really ridiculous on the turn, I'm probably gonna call the turn. I think half pot is pretty good here. You should have a lot of like 6, 7, 7, 8 type hands here. Try to get some value from them. And King Jack now is a near nothing type hand, so I can just check this hand down. That's one big blind. I think this hand does look him up, although again, you know, I should be losing the overwhelming majority of the time. But you know, that's a hand where I can, or that's a sizing against which I can lose the overwhelming majority of the hand and still be profitable, right? So have to think about it in terms of odds and frequencies rather than just being a binary, do I have the best hand or not? Eights here facing an itty bitty 3-bet, probably, especially with a little depth, impossible for me to fold this hand. Although, you know, because, you know, I'm out of position, the rake is high, my opponent's likely to have kind of a strong range because he's baiting me pre-flop. All of these things, you know, are pretty dangerous here. Well, this hand definitely would like to go for some protection. I think that my opponent is going to be very ace or king high heavy when he just checks back, or like ace king heavy in particular. And if that is my argument, then obviously there's not going to be too much value here on the river. Wow, he mini 3-bet king queen checks flop, and then ends up only getting a quarter of a street of value from me when he probably could have gotten, you know, maybe like a third to go. These guys are just clicking buttons. They're clicking buttons and leading to inefficient results. That's kind of what's going on here. 8 and 9 with what we perceive to be a slightly weaker player in the blinds. A bunch of different strategies I can play on Queen 10-8. Can play small bets. Probably don't want to play over bets because villain can have just like offsuit Jack 9. Although he should, in theory, 3-bet some of those as part of his polar strategy, but I doubt that is actually the case in these stakes. So in theory, you get to play like larger bets there, but in practice, you probably don't get to just like start smashing immediately. Have a massive hand on table 4. Just gonna play it as a call. The ace high flush comes in, or the ace high flush draw comes in. He leads turn, leads river. I don't really know what he has there, but I am a little bit suspicious. A7 against 2 players. probably not good enough for me to barrel off, so this hand would definitely be a check on the flop. But now that my opponent just like bets large out of the small blind two-way, I'm actually just going to go ahead and fold this hand with no robust equity or ability to improve my hand. It's just basically a pure reverse implied odds hand. And the likelihood that my opponent is going to follow through on a subsequent street is also very high. So because I don't think my hand is good, and I don't think that it's likely that I'm going to be able to show it down cheaply, obviously it must just be a flop fold. And it looks criminal, but there's plenty of times when we are looking at GTO where we'll see that these kind of plays are totally fine. Once your opponent begins to, make large polarized bets on the flop, very, very likely that we can kind of get away from our hands. So, let's say we raise pocket jacks pre-flop under the gun, and the button 3-bets us and we defend. And the flop comes just like 5-5-3 or something like this. And we check in, our opponent pots it or bets large there. That's going to be a spot where when we have pocket jacks or pocket tens, those hands now begin to think about folding because, for the same reasons. We're now facing a polar range where our hand is now like a very pure bluff catcher. And I think sevens is going to be a fold, but I always want to call like twos, threes, fours, fives when I have them. And it's going to be a mix there. Obviously, I want to call sevens with that depth some percentage of the time, but it's never a pure call. Completely lost my train of thought, which is, I mean, par for the course when I'm four tabling and commentating for an hour. Oh, but I was still talking about how jacks and tens can just fold out of position in a 3-bit pot. Once your opponent just says, "Hey, I just have aces, kings, queens. You have a pure bluff catcher. Let's run it." All strategies are good here. I think that there's argument for betting small here. They're going to play poorly against that. I think this is because we have a little bit of depth. There's argument for having a large betting size because we have like queens there that wants to just begin to shovel the money as fast as possible. Here in table 4, this is a weaker player, so I put in a small 3-bet to isolate him. There's 22 big blinds in the pot, so the question is, what is the correct sizing to 4-bet here with ace king here? I do think that we, even with this depth here, about like 150-ish, money starts to go in. On table 2, facing a min raise, ace queen just becomes a very standard call. But now that the team has joined in the party, I want to raise and isolate this weaker player heads up. Tens, definitely a mix here. And, a hand that is not very comfortable just going 3 large streets. Probably means I can start with a check sometimes. Gonna go for a little bit of shenanigans. This should be what I imagine to be an extremely rare play here. And now go for a large bet against ace high. I can actually probably go pot or maybe even overbet there. I think that's reasonable. Villain bets. Can't really fold pairs yet. This hand probably now plays well as bet 3-bet, I think. But definitely just wants to block to try to get like a call from ace high. All ace high has to call there, right? If villain is not calling me with virtually all of his ace high there, he's overfolding. And on some of those boards, he actually should be calling me with like king queen high, like the nut nothing, assuming that I'm not going to be ever blocking with an ace myself. But sometimes I do block with an ace because sometimes I go for value there. So you're really put in a weird spot because I go for exploitative ace high bets as well. Raise it up, get a nice wheel flop where we're going to start with a check. Obviously going to check call the flop. Villain bets half pot here. And because we have some depth behind us, want to start raising in with a polarized strategy. Here ace jack seems still too good. Villain re-raises us, which I'm like obviously not stoked about, but I guess money goes in, and if he has aces, he's got aces. Right? If he's got aces, he's got aces, and that's gross. He has threes. Threes are not aces. Okay, running good. Started off running really, really bad. But now making up for it through my opponent's general shenanigans. 10-2. Incentive to both bet. Gonna have a lot of checks here because on the 2x board, gonna have to give some credit to my opponent. Here, gonna play overbet or check on table 4, and so this time I'm gonna go ahead and check. Eights is close. Check again. Now, obviously, gonna call with a king. Now, obviously, gonna call with a king and a jack. I think this is a spot where my opponent never has a better hand than me, and then I can reach this node and sorry, I lost my train of thought again. Big surprise. Looking at all of these hands. I think a 4-bet here makes sense. And now that we've reached this river, I think I'm just going to lead myself here because villain just should not have that many 8s. Gonna start with a small bet. Villain should just not have that many, like, really strong hands, and I should still have all of the aces, kings, queens pre-flop. I mean, he can have queens here, but I block some queens. I hold a 10 here, which is good because, I expect a lot of his range here to be like queens, jacks, 10s. Unfortunately, it looks like he's just had a jack, so I'm just going to fold. But I do like following up on a jack because a lot of the times, if villain did call with a jack X type hand pre-flop, he does fold the flop, right? Like, queen jack suited, king jack suited. So it's more likely that I'm going to be able to hit that turn and follow through cleanly than my opponent in a lot of spots. I folded ace queen there. What the fuck? I'm an idiot. We have depth here, so gonna make this a little bit bigger than normal with aces. Not gonna bluff on these XXYY boards. I think that's just something that we've seen, over and over. But I will go for, thin value very, very consistently in those kind of spots because I just do think that you get picked off by ace high way too often. But that also means that, if I'm very confident my opponent has ace high, sometimes I'll try to play to get him off a chop as well. Here against a weaker opponent, just gonna let him tell me the strength of his hand and kind of proceed from here. I mean, probably not even gonna bluff the river with this hand because there is, some ability for me to just win the river when it goes check check. Here, when I have suits that mismatch the board, gonna start with more checks than usual. And now if check 2 twice, I'm gonna turn my hand into a bluff. Here on ace queen 9 against a fishier player, gonna start with a check. Definitely some merit. Wow, he immediately pots it. I mean, still not gonna fold here. And actually, I do beat 9-10. I beat some hearts. Let me just check back here. Wow, he has ace. Okay, well, If I knew he had that hand, I would absolutely never give up in that spot. And because he bet kind of small on the turn, I think it's unlikely that he's going to bet the river himself, so I'm just going to go ahead and lead. Villain min raises here. He can only have like 9s or ace-9 that beat me here. 9s would make sense, but obviously still going to jam myself. It's a very narrow range that I lose to there. Looks like villain had two pair. Two pair and then raise called the river. Not good. Here I call with ace jack. I mean, it's not the best river call. Because I do block like, 10 jack, some queen jack type hands. But now that he checks, I think that I can check and just beat like a 6x, a 7x. And obviously there, right? He had like king queen, so when he arrives on the river, he's gonna have a bunch of hands that I just beat. Although I imagine some of those will obviously fire through the river as well, but I was gonna call a lot of them. I don't know why. Why is it when the card that hits him comes in, he suddenly goes into bluff catching mode? Here, I'm gonna start with a small bet on the flop. Gonna follow through on a lot of turns with this hand. Want to fire mostly diamonds and clubs here on this turn. Oh, sorry, diamonds and hearts on this turn. So just gonna check here. I think betting here is also very reasonable. No one down bets river. It's close. Do I want to ever raise here? Like, can I have jacks here? I mean, I guess I can have jacks here sometimes. I think this might be, again, the kind of spot where if I am turning that hand into a bluff, I'm going to be neglecting having enough folds. Five nine, got to be very close, but definitely has to be near the bottom of my suited range here. Raise pre-flop, c-bet this flop, and now with king high, just not going to really put in any more money. But still going to just keep raising these small blinds, particularly when they're not full stacked, because I just think that they're often, very weak. Sometimes they just fold here. Ace-2, a little bit too weak to traditionally raise, but, we think that this villain's going to be really bad, and obviously, when he does things like min-raise here, we're just going to realize too much equity, right, obviously, so I think when villain snaps back, he just does not have a pair here, so I'm going to go for very thin value. Well, now he just super smashes, so maybe I should have just checked to him there, but I think a lot of the time the correct way to play against the weaker players is just pretend that their hand is face up, right? And if you play as if you know their hand, a surprising amount of the time you'll be like, oh, wow, this play worked. And that's obviously only true once you have a certain level of control over your opponent. There's this paradox that low stakes players have versus high stakes players, where low stakes players will say, oh, well, all of this stuff that I learned from a solver, all this GTO nonsense, it doesn't actually really work at the small stakes. It only really works when you get to a higher level. And that's, there's has to be some point where you transition from playing like whatever your ultra exploit style is to playing something that is a little bit more solver strategic. And so like I just don't understand like why are people so like hesitant to find that sweet spot. No, villain has better trips. Good for him. I just think that if you have the argument that oh, I should be playing whatever my hyper exploit style at these small stakes. A lot of people who do that, good for them, but they're not crushing the game. And so if you're playing like hyper exploit and you think that you know better than GTO, but you're not crushing the game, then how good is your exploit really? Because if you knew what all of your opponents were doing and they were face up, you should have just like some ridiculous, enormous win rate where you can make hero folds, hero calls, etc., right? Get to do like the really, really super exploitative stuff. But the fact of the matter is, the overwhelming majority of the time, even when I see players, are saying, "Oh, I play really, really exploit," they don't play anywhere near as exploitative as they should be. Everyone just checked me so fast on the river that I don't think that they have that too many aces here. So just gonna go for a bet. Um, but for example, on a lot of rivers, if your opponent overfolds, you should be going absolutely berserk on them. I mean, just like coming after them with like third pair, second pair. I mean, virtually everything that has no showdown value should now turn itself into a bluff. And a lot of hands that have like a decent amount of showdown value, I mean, even like second pair bad kicker, should now turn itself into a bluff if it's possible that it can get your opponent to fold a slightly better hand. And this is just not how players will naturally play, right? And so we have to just kind of acknowledge when we say, oh, we're playing super, super exploit, it's only as exploit as you are brave, right? Because there are just some exploits that a solver reveals are really, really good, but just, will come up with whatever philosophical reason or mental gymnastics not to play that strategy. That's something that I initially did when I started down this road and was learning how to play with like down bets. And I'd just, like down bet all the time. And I just wasn't convinced that this was a great strategy because there were just so many times where um, this is super close to facing us this sizing here. I think, I mean, obviously 100 big blinds is deep, I always call here, but I think I actually just get to muck there without a spade. Again, lost my train of thought talking about exploit versus, like practice. Um, Here I think it makes sense to double overbet having both a 6 and the ace of spades. Feeling ultra snap calls me. Good for him. Call my ass so fast. Lightning speed. And this is also kind of the problem, right? Like if your opponents are they're, completely indifferent to your sizing, well, then obviously you need to be going for value with these very, very large sizings as well, right? Because if my opponent is not even looking at the sizing and just pressing call, then why would I ever value bet, for a small amount, right? I should be value betting for something, ridiculous. And not just with the hands that I think are like theoretically very good to value bet, but like, if I think I'm way ahead of my opponent and I have third pair top kicker, I should overbet there. So like here, let's say on table 4, I bet the flop, turn checks through, and we get to the river, right? Like I get to have a lot of overbets in this spot. One open ender gets in there, but I do block it with a 10. So I'm obviously not thrilled if I get raised here, but don't think that it'll happen that often. And still want to go for some value against the jack. Because I think a lot of my opponent's range is going to be like gut shots that river a pair with the jack. So I want to make sure that I bet to still punish them. Okay, gonna wrap things up. I think that's been a little bit more than an hour. Hopefully I think this was a slightly winning session. Kind of hard to tell because I got stacked a couple times, but hopefully this was useful for you guys. As always, please like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content, and I'll just keep putting out some live play and explains because this is what you guys love to watch. This is Album Teaches Poker for Album Teaches Poker. Peace out.